11:15. The Coral Sea, 40 miles south of nothing. The stick vibrates in Stanley Vejtasa's right hand. The engine oil temperature is climbing. There is a hole in his left wing, the size of a dinner plate, and the wind through it makes a sound like a man screaming very far away. He can smell the cordite from his own guns. He can smell the hydraulic fluid leaking somewhere behind the instrument panel. Behind him, his radio man is shouting numbers Vejtasa cannot hear over the engine. 3 shadows cross his canopy, left to right, fast. He does not look up. He already knows what they are. 3 Japanese pilots from the Imperial Navy, trained for years, undefeated in the Pacific. Their Mitsubishi A6M Zeros are the fastest carrier fighters in the world, and they are closing at a rate his Douglas SBD Dauntless cannot outrun. Vejtasa's hands are steady. His breathing is slow. He is 27 years old. He is about to survive the next 90 seconds. 4 of his squadron mates will not. Stanley Winfield Vejtasa was born in a small farming town in eastern Montana in the summer of 1914. His parents were Czech immigrants. His father worked wheat. His mother kept the house and the 4 children clean, fed, and quiet. There was no ocean in eastern Montana. There was no airfield within 200 miles. The nearest thing to an aircraft that Stanley Vejtasa saw as a boy was a hawk on the fence line, watching the wheat move. He studied at Montana State College. He transferred to the University of Montana. He was tall and quiet and good at mathematics. In 1937, at the age of 23, he walked into a Navy recruiting office and signed his name. He was commissioned an ensign 2 years later. He earned his wings on July 13, 1939. He was assigned to Scouting Squadron 5 aboard the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown in August of that year. For 2.5 years, he flew biplanes, Curtiss SBC-3 Helldivers, fabric wings and open cockpits, and the kind of aircraft that would have felt familiar to a pilot from the First World War. Then, the war came, and the Yorktown crossed the Panama Canal, and the biplanes were traded for the Douglas SBD Dauntless. And Vejtasa learned how to dive a metal aircraft at a moving ship from 12,000 feet in the air. By March of 1942, he had killed his first Japanese pilots. The action was over Salamaua and Lae on the northeast coast of New Guinea. Yorktown's dive bombers hit a Japanese naval force at anchor. 3 Imperial destroyers went to the bottom. Vejtasa pressed his dive through anti-aircraft fire that turned the air white. He earned his first Navy Cross. He was 27 years old, and he had learned something the training manuals had not taught him. The Japanese pilots he was fighting were not amateurs. 5,000 miles away, on the flight deck of the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku, a man named Kakuichi Takahashi was reading intelligence reports about the same American squadron that had killed his sister ship's destroyers. Takahashi was 35 years old. He had been an officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy for more than a decade. He had led the dive bombers that struck Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941. He had led dive bombers during the Indian Ocean Raid in April 1942. He was one of the most experienced strike leaders alive. Takahashi did not know Vejtasa's name. Vejtasa did not know Takahashi's name. In 30 days, one of them would be dead. The Japanese pilots of the 5th Carrier Division were the elite of the Imperial Navy. The 2 carriers they flew from, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had been completed less than a year earlier. Each ship carried 72 aircraft. Each ship carried men who had trained for 5, 6, 7 years. The Japanese pilots of Zukaku's fighter squadron averaged more than 500 hours of combat flight time. The best of them had more than 800. They had killed in China. They had killed at Pearl Harbor. They had killed over Rabaul. They had killed over the Indian Ocean. The American pilots of Scouting Squadron 5, by comparison, had learned their trade in peacetime. They had trained on ranges. They had bombed towed sleds. Most of them had never fired a machine gun at another aircraft until the war began. The math was ugly. In the first 5 months of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots flying the Mitsubishi A6M0 had achieved a kill ratio of 12-1 against American, British, Dutch, and Australian aircraft. For every Japanese pilot lost, 12 Allied pilots died. And on the morning of May 7, 1942, the two air groups met. The target that day was a smaller Japanese carrier called Shoho. She was a converted submarine tender. She carried about 30 aircraft. She was screening the invasion force that Imperial Japan had sent south to seize Port Moresby on the coast of New Guinea. If Port Moresby fell, Australia would be within reach of Japanese bombers. The strike from Yorktown and Lexington caught Shoho with her deck almost empty. 93 American aircraft hove on her at once. Vejtasa was among them. He put his bomb near the stern of the carrier. 12 other bombs found the same ship. 7 torpedoes tore open her hull. In 10 minutes, Shoho was a burning hulk. In 15 minutes, she was gone. Lieutenant Commander Bob Dixon of Lexington's Scouting Squadron called it in with 3 words that would enter the history books. Scratch one flat-top. But that night, on the flight deck of Shokaku, Kakuichi Takahashi was already planning the counter-strike. His mechanics were arming his aircraft. His pilots were sleeping in ready rooms with their flight suits still on. The 2 carriers of the 5th Carrier Division were steaming south. The Japanese pilots knew what was coming. So did the Americans. On Yorktown, Vejtasa did not sleep well. Nobody did. The wardroom was quiet. The pilots sat in silence. The ship was blacked out. In the compartments below, sailors patched bomb holes from the Tulagi raid. On the flight deck, mechanics tuned engines by flashlight. Somewhere, north, on a Japanese carrier, other men were doing the same thing. At 6 in the morning on May 8, 1942, both fleets launched their strike aircraft. Kakuichi Takahashi lifted off from Shokaku at the head of a strike package of 69 aircraft. 27 were dive bombers, 20 were torpedo planes, 18 were Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, flying escort. The Japanese pilots knew exactly where the American carriers were. The Japanese pilots knew exactly how few American fighters were available to stop them. Yorktown had a problem. The carrier had launched most of her strike force against the Japanese fleet. 53 dive bombers and 22 torpedo planes were somewhere north hunting for Shokaku. The 9 Wildcat fighters remaining aboard were the only air defense for the entire task force. 9 fighters against a strike package that outnumbered them 10-1. Captain Frederick Sherman of USS Lexington had thought about this problem for weeks. He had come up with a solution that no navy in the world had ever tried in combat. Sherman wanted to use the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers as makeshift interceptors. The Dauntless carried 2 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. It could dive on incoming Japanese torpedo planes from above and shoot them down before they released their weapons. It had never been tested in combat. Nobody knew if it would work. Nobody had asked the dive bomber pilots what they thought. At 7:30 in the morning, on orders from the air officer of USS Yorktown, 8 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft launched from the flight deck. They were assigned to a mission that had no manual, no doctrine, and no precedent. Anti-torpedo plane patrol. They were to orbit at low altitude between the American carriers and any incoming Japanese aircraft. They were to shoot down anything they saw. Lieutenant Junior Grade Stanley Vejtasa led 4 of the 8. Behind him in the rear cockpit, his radioman checked the twin 30 caliber machine guns and set the safety. The Coral Sea rolled beneath them. The sun climbed higher. The morning was clear. 60 miles to the north, hidden in cloud, 69 Japanese aircraft were coming to kill them. The first Japanese aircraft they sighted were dying. At 10:32 on the morning of May 8, the American strike from Yorktown found the Japanese carriers under partial cloud cover. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Powers of Bombing Squadron 5 pushed his Douglas SBD Dauntless into a dive that carried him below 200 feet above the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Shokaku. He released his 1,000-pound bomb. The explosion killed him. It also opened a hole in Shokaku's forward flight deck that would burn for the next 6 hours. Powers would receive the Medal of Honor. He would not live to see it. The Japanese pilots aboard Shokaku were beginning to panic. Fires were spreading down the hangar deck. Aviation gasoline was leaking from ruptured lines. Kakuichi Takahashi's own carrier was becoming uninhabitable, and Takahashi did not know it, because Takahashi was already in the air, leading his strike package south toward the American fleet. Radar aboard Lexington picked them up at 10:55, 68 miles, bearing 320, closing at 180 knots. The 9 Wildcats of the American Combat Air Patrol were vectored to intercept. The fighter direction officers made a mistake that would cost lives. They put the Wildcats at low altitude, expecting torpedo planes. The Japanese pilots were flying at 10,000 feet. The Wildcats missed them completely. That left the 8 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft of Vejtasa's anti-torpedo patrol as the only barrier between the Japanese strike force and the American carriers. 8 slow, heavy, unmaneuverable dive bombers. 69 Japanese pilots with more combat experience than the entire United States Navy had accumulated between 1919 and 1941. Vejtasa saw them first. They came out of the clouds to the north like a shoal of dark fish rising to the surface. He counted more than 50 aircraft. He watched them break apart as they descended. The Japanese pilots knew their business. The dive bombers climbed. The torpedo planes dropped low toward the wave tops. The Zero fighters swept ahead of the strike package, hunting for exactly what they now saw. 8 Zeros peeled off from the escort and turned toward Vejtasa's 4-plane section. 8 against 4. The Japanese pilots must have thought it would be easy. In every other engagement of the Pacific War so far, it had been. The Zeros opened fire at 800 yards. Every training manual in the United States Navy said the same thing about what came next. When a Japanese pilot dove on your tail from above, you were supposed to run. You were supposed to point the nose of your Dauntless toward the deck and let gravity build speed. You were supposed to reach the anti-aircraft cover of the fleet before the Zero caught you. That was doctrine. That was survival. Vejtasa did the opposite. He hauled his stick hard left and pulled back. The Dauntless groaned. The The wings shuddered. The horizon tilted violently, and Vejtasa's nose came up and around and pointed directly at the lead Zero closing on him. The Japanese pilot had expected a tail chase. He had expected a fleeing target. Instead, he found himself looking at the front of an American dive bomber growing larger in his windscreen at a combined closure rate of over 500 miles an hour. The Zero broke off. Vejtasa held his fire. Not yet. Not yet. The next Japanese pilot was already committing to his own attack pass. The tactic had a name in Vejtasa's head. He did not know if his commanding officer had actually taught it to him, or if he had invented it in the moment. It did not matter. What mattered was the geometry. When a faster aircraft dove on him from behind, the natural response was to turn away. But turning away gave the attacker a straight, predictable target. The bullets would find their mark every time. Turning into the attack changed everything. The angle of the shot became impossible to calculate. The closure rate became terrifying. The Japanese pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to aim, fire, and pull away before the two aircraft collided. Most Japanese pilots could not make that shot. Vejtasa found this out because he was still alive when the second Zero broke past his canopy and disappeared behind him. Behind him, his radioman was firing. The twin 30 caliber machine guns hammered in short, controlled bursts. The empty brass cascaded across the rear cockpit floor. The radioman was screaming coordinates, headings, warnings, anything. Vejtasa could hear none of it. The engine noise was too loud. The wind through the canopy was too loud. His own pulse was too loud. Around him, the other 3 Dauntlesses of his section were dying. The first one went down in the opening minute. A Japanese pilot had lined up on the tail of the aircraft, flown by the pilot on Vejtasa's right wing. The Zero fired one burst. The Dauntless flashed white and orange and rolled inverted. There was no parachute. The wreckage fell 6,000 feet before it hit the sea. The second Dauntless lasted perhaps 3 minutes. 3 Japanese pilots coordinated on it. The rear gunner kept firing until the tail came off. Then the aircraft spun. The third Dauntless of Vejtasa's section fell inside the next 2 minutes. He never saw exactly how. He only saw the smoke trail. Half of Scouting Squadron 5 had been destroyed in the first 5 minutes of the engagement. Vejtasa turned into the next attack. The Japanese pilot committed too deeply. Vejtasa saw him hold the pass a fraction of a second too long, trying to score hits before breaking away. The 50 caliber rounds from Vejtasa's forward-firing guns walked across the Zero's engine cowling. The Nakajima Sakai radial engine exploded in a spray of oil and coolant that instantly became flame. The Zero rolled onto its back. The pilot did not bail out. The aircraft fell into the Coral Sea. 1. The second Zero came from his high left. He turned into it. The Japanese pilot fired too late. The Mitsubishi disintegrated in the air. 2. The third kill was different. The third kill would be argued about for the next 80 years. Vejtasa was climbing back to altitude after the second engagement when a Japanese pilot came at him head-on. This one was more experienced. This one held the closure rate steady. This one did not break off. Vejtasa did not break off either. 2 aircraft. Combined closure rate of over 500 miles an hour. Distance closing at more than 250 yards every second. At the last possible moment, both pilots twitched their sticks. Both aircraft banked. They passed within feet of each other. Some accounts written after the war would claim that Vejtasa's right wingtip actually struck the Zero's left wingtip, that the impact sheared off enough of the Japanese fighter's aileron to send it into an uncontrollable roll, that the Zero spiraled into the sea from 4,000 feet. Vejtasa himself would tell the story that way to his squadron mates when he landed. His radioman would confirm it. The Yorktown action report would credit him with 3 Zero fighters destroyed on May 8, 1942. 3. The Japanese records tell a more complicated story. The Imperial Japanese Navy carrier Zuikaku, whose fighter squadron had provided most of the Zero escort that day, recorded her losses in her war diary. 4 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters were listed as failing to return. That matched the 4 confirmed kills claimed by Vejtasa's entire squadron. But historians who later reconstructed the engagement, including John Lundstrom in his authoritative work, The First Team, concluded that several American pilots had likely claimed the same aircraft. Vejtasa may have shot down 1 Japanese pilot that day. He may have shot down 2. The precise attribution of 3 cannot be verified from the surviving records. What is certain is that 4 Japanese pilots did not return to Zuikaku on the evening of May 8, 1942. What is certain is that Vejtasa flew a Douglas SBD Dauntless into the middle of the most experienced fighter force in the Pacific Ocean and emerged alive. What is certain is that 4 of his 8 squadron mates did not. The rest of the Japanese strike had gotten through. While Vejtasa was fighting for his life against the Zero escort, Kakuichi Takahashi was leading his dive bombers over Yorktown. The Japanese pilots came down from 18,000 feet in near vertical dives. Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts. 7 Japanese dive bombers were shot out of the air before they could release. 26 kept coming. At 11:27 in the morning, a bomb from one of Takahashi's pilots struck Yorktown's flight deck near the number 2 elevator. The bomb penetrated 4 decks before it detonated. 66 American sailors died in the explosion and the fires that followed. Another sailor would die of his wounds in the following days. Kakuichi Takahashi did not return to Shokaku that afternoon. He was killed in the attack on Yorktown. The wreckage of his Aichi D-3A dive bomber went into the Coral Sea. He was 35 years old. He had been a naval aviator for 11 years. He had led the dive bombers at Pearl Harbor. He would not be replaced. While Takahashi's dive bombers were breaking apart above Yorktown, the torpedo planes of Zuikaku were finishing their attack on Lexington. 2 Japanese torpedoes struck the port side of the American carrier. The damage seemed manageable. The fires were contained. Damage control teams patched the flooding. For nearly an hour, it looked as if Lexington would survive. Then, something no one had planned for happened. Aviation gasoline vapor from ruptured fuel lines had accumulated in Lexington's lower compartments. At 12:47, an electrical spark ignited it. The first explosion tore through the ship. More explosions followed throughout the afternoon. At 5 in the evening, Captain Frederick Sherman ordered the crew to abandon ship. At 7:32, USS Lexington slipped beneath the surface of the Coral Sea. 216 men went down with her. Vejtasa landed on Yorktown a few minutes past noon. The Dauntless had taken 37 bullet holes. The right wing had a piece of shrapnel through it, the size of a man's fist. The canopy glass was cracked. The hydraulic lines were leaking. The rudder cable was frayed. Ground crews stared at the aircraft for a long time before they said anything. Vejtasa climbed down, his radioman climbed down. They walked to the ready room together. Neither man spoke for a long time. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over. Tactically, both sides claimed victory. Strategically, the Americans had won. Port Moresby had been saved. But the price had been Lexington, 66 men killed on Yorktown, and every dive bomber pilot who did not come back. Half of Vejtasa's section did not come back. Word of what he had done spread through the air group before the day was over. A dive bomber pilot from Scouting Squadron 5 had turned into 8 Japanese pilots and emerged with 3 claimed kills. The tactic had never been in any manual. The result had never been seen before in the Pacific War. Within days, orders arrived. Vejtasa was being transferred out of dive bombers. The Navy needed fighter pilots more than it needed anything else. 3 of the 6 American fleet carriers in the Pacific had been sunk or heavily damaged in 5 months. Saratoga was still under repair from a submarine torpedo. Lexington was on the bottom of the Coral Sea. Yorktown was limping toward Pearl Harbor with a bomb-damaged flight deck. Only Enterprise and Hornet were fully operational. The Battle of Midway was less than a month away, and every experienced pilot in the fleet was needed. Vejtasa was assigned to Fighting Squadron 10, a new unit. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander James Henry Flatley, Jr. Flatley had fought at Coral Sea aboard Lexington. Flatley had faced Japanese pilots in a Wildcat. Flatley had studied the Mitsubishi A6M and had written a memorandum to the Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, arguing that the American aircraft could beat the Japanese fighter, but only if American pilots were trained differently. His memo argued that the Zero was fragile, and that its lightweight construction and lack of armor made it destructible by a single, well-placed burst, that its lightweight controls became sluggish at speeds above 350 miles an hour, and that a Wildcat in a dive could escape it. Flatley called for aggressive tactics. He called for teamwork. He called his squadron the Grim Reapers. Vejtasa arrived at Naval Air Station San Diego in June of 1942. His reputation had preceded him. The dive bomber pilot who had turned into the Japanese pilots at Coral Sea. The man who had come home when others had not. Flatley recognized what he was looking at and made Vejtasa his operations officer. Third in command of the entire squadron. Over the summer of 1942, Vejtasa and Flatley developed what would become the most aggressive fighter tactics in the United States Navy. Vejtasa did not want to fight defensively. He argued that the Thack Weave, the defensive maneuver developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, was excellent for keeping Wildcat pilots alive, but insufficient for killing Japanese pilots. Vejtasa pushed for high-altitude attacks, slashing runs through Japanese formations. Hit hard, break away, climb, come back. Flatley listened. Flatley incorporated the ideas into squadron training. By the fall of 1942, Fighting Squadron 10 was ready. The strategic situation had changed since Coral Sea. In June, the Battle of Midway had killed 4 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers and hundreds of the Imperial Navy's best pilots. In August, American Marines had landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, seizing an airfield the Japanese had been building. But the Imperial Navy was not finished. In October, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto assembled a strike force to smash the American carriers supporting the Guadalcanal campaign and to reinforce the Japanese ground troops trying to retake the airfield. 4 Japanese carriers, 4 battleships, 14 cruisers, more than 40 destroyers, hundreds of Japanese pilots. Vice Admiral William Halsey, newly appointed commander of the South Pacific, sent his answer to Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid aboard USS Enterprise. 2 words: attack. Repeat, attack. Fighting Squadron 10 was on Enterprise. Vejtasa was the operations officer. The Japanese pilots on Shokaku and Zuikaku, both now repaired and reinforced with new aircrews, were waiting. The engagement would be called the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. It would be fought on October 26, 1942. But the disaster nearly began the day before. At 2:25 in the afternoon of October 25, Rear Admiral Kinkaid, receiving reports that put the Japanese carrier force within striking distance, ordered Enterprise to launch a search mission. 12 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers went out along search vectors that Vejtasa, when he was briefed on them, immediately recognized as pointing in the wrong direction. 30 minutes later, Kinkaid ordered the rest of the Enterprise air group to launch behind them. Fighters, torpedo planes, everything. Vejtasa was incredulous. The launch time meant the aircraft would be returning after dark. Radio silence would prevent communication. The task force was maneuvering to avoid Japanese submarines and would not be where the pilots expected it to be. Finding an aircraft carrier at night, low on fuel, in complete radio silence, was one of the hardest things a naval aviator could do. Kinkaid was asking the entire Enterprise air group to do it after a fruitless 4-hour search along the wrong bearing. The pilots of Fighting Squadron 10 protested through the chain of command. The orders were unchanged. Vejtasa launched with the rest of the Grim Reapers at approximately 3 in the afternoon. He flew his assigned search vector for hours. He saw nothing. As the sun dropped, the fuel gauges began to tell the ugly truth. Some of the pilots did not have enough fuel to reach the recovery point. At dusk, the air group turned back toward the calculated position of Enterprise. Enterprise was not there. Kinkaid had maneuvered the task force throughout the afternoon. The carrier was now miles from where her pilots expected to find her. Radio silence meant no vectors could be broadcast. Aircraft began running out of fuel and ditching in the open sea. Others circled desperately in the failing light, watching their gauges drop toward empty. Vejtasa remembered something from that morning's combat air patrol. Enterprise had been leaking fuel oil. A thin, dark slick trailed behind her, visible from altitude as a streak against the water. In the dim light of dusk, he dropped his Wildcat lower. He began to search for the oil slick. He found it. Vejtasa followed the trail through the fading light and located Enterprise. He led other aircraft back to her. Deck crews worked in conditions that would have been unsafe in daylight. Some pilots crashed on landing. Others ran out of fuel in the pattern and ditched alongside the ship. By midnight, most of the air group had been recovered, just barely. Kinkaid's report on the operation would not mention the oil slick. It would not mention Vejtasa. It would not mention that the entire Enterprise air group had come within minutes of destruction before the battle had even begun. At 6:45 the next morning, both sides launched search aircraft. At 7:40, a Japanese scout reported the American carriers. At 7:50, Enterprise radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft. Fighting Squadron 10 had 8 Wildcats airborne on combat air patrol. Vejtasa was one of them. At 8:22 in the morning, Enterprise radar operators reported a massive formation approaching from the northwest. More than 60 Japanese aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. The entire striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 5th Carrier Division was inbound. Vejtasa checked his ammunition, full load. He checked his fuel. Enough for 40 minutes of combat. He scanned the horizon to the northwest. The sky was filling with Japanese pilots. The first wave hit USS Hornet at 8:50. 27 Japanese aircraft from Shokaku descended on the American task force. 15 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, 12 Nakajima B-5N torpedo planes. A screen of Zero fighters flew top cover. The formation was led by Lieutenant Sadamu Takahashi. It was well flown. It was disciplined. It was exactly the kind of coordinated strike the Imperial Navy had been perfecting for years. American fighter direction failed almost immediately. Radio channels were jammed. Radar operators struggled to track multiple altitudes at once. The 8 Wildcats of Fighting Squadron 10 were scattered across the sky, each pilot fighting alone. Vejtasa spotted 2 Aichi D-3A Vals beginning their dive on Hornet from 18,000 feet. He pushed his throttle to the stop. The Pratt & Whitney engine of his Wildcat strained at maximum power. He clawed for altitude. The Japanese pilots were already committed. Their fixed landing gear created the whistling scream that had become the sound of terror for Allied sailors across the Pacific. He intercepted them at 12,000 feet. His first burst caught the lead valve in the engine. Pieces flew off. The aircraft staggered. The Japanese pilot tried to hold his dive. He could not. The valve rolled over slowly and fell away without releasing its bomb. 1. The second valve was already past him. Vejtasa rolled his Wildcat inverted and pulled through. He fired a long burst at extreme range. He saw hits along the fuselage. The valve kept diving toward Hornet. Below him, the American carrier was being hit. A 500-pound bomb struck Hornet's flight deck. Then another. A burning Japanese aircraft, possibly the one Vejtasa had just damaged, crashed directly into the ship's stack. Aviation gasoline sprayed across the signal bridge. 2 torpedoes hit the starboard side within 3 minutes. By 9:15 in the morning, Hornet was burning from bow to stern. Vejtasa had no time to watch. Enterprise was next. The second wave appeared on radar at 9:30, 44 Japanese aircraft. Leading the attack were 20 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers flying low and fast toward the only surviving American fleet carrier in the Pacific Ocean. Vejtasa dove toward them. The Japanese pilots were approaching from multiple directions. A coordinated attack designed to catch Enterprise no matter which way she turned. The only defense was to break up the attack before the Kates could release their torpedoes. Vejtasa selected a group of 11 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo planes, boring in from the port side of Enterprise. He came at them from above and behind. He used altitude to build speed. His 650 caliber machine guns opened fire at 300 yards. The first Kate exploded. The Japanese formation scattered. 3 of the Japanese pilots jettisoned their torpedoes into the sea and turned away. Their carefully planned attack was coming apart under a single Wildcat. Vejtasa stayed with them. He shot down a second Kate. He shot down a third. His Wildcat was taking hits from the Japanese rear gunners. He did not care. A 4th Kate fell. A 5th Kate fell. 5 torpedo bombers destroyed in approximately 4 minutes. Combined with the 2 valves earlier, Vejtasa had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. No American pilot had ever done that. Enterprise took 2 bomb hits during the battle. 3 near misses opened seams in her hull. Fires burned in 3 compartments. But the torpedo attack that should have finished her had been broken by a single Wildcat and its pilot, and the great carrier stayed afloat, and she stayed in the fight. Vejtasa landed on Enterprise shortly after 10 in the morning. His Wildcat was streaked with oil. The wings were holed. He climbed out onto the deck and walked past sailors fighting fires and stretcher-bearers carrying men below. He went to the ready room. He filled out his combat report in pencil. 2 Vals, 5 Kates, 7 Japanese pilots destroyed. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley read the report that evening. Flatley had watched pieces of the engagement from his own cockpit. Flatley knew exactly what he had witnessed. He picked up Vejtasa's flight logbook and turned to the page for October 26, 1942. He wrote 7 words in his own hand, greatest single combat fight record in history. Then he drafted a nomination for the Medal of Honor. Flatley documented everything: the 2 Vals, the 5 Kates, the broken torpedo attack, the saved carrier. He compared Vejtasa's engagement to Lieutenant Edward O'Hare's famous action of February 1942, when O'Hare had shot down 5 Japanese pilots in a single mission and received the Medal of Honor for it. Vejtasa had shot down 7, 2 more than O'Hare, in circumstances equally desperate, against Japanese pilots equally skilled. The nomination traveled up the chain of command. It reached Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid. Kinkaid had problems of his own. The Battle of Santa Cruz was a tactical defeat for the United States Navy. Hornet had been abandoned by her crew that afternoon. Japanese destroyers finished her with torpedoes after nightfall. Enterprise was the only American fleet carrier still operational in the Pacific Ocean. Questions were beginning to be asked about the disastrous search mission of October 25, about the failure of fighter direction, about why so few Wildcats had been in position to intercept Japanese pilots when they came. A Medal of Honor for Vejtasa would attract reporters. Reporters would ask questions. The questions would lead back to the man who had ordered the search mission and mismanaged the fighter direction. Kinkaid downgraded the nomination. Vejtasa received a Gold Star in lieu of a 3rd Navy Cross. The citation acknowledged the 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed. It said nothing about the Medal of Honor recommendation that Flatley had submitted. The pilots of Fighting Squadron 10 were stunned. Dive bomber pilot Hal Buell, who had flown with Vejtasa at Coral Sea, would later write that Vejtasa deserved the Medal of Honor for his flying at Coral Sea alone, let alone what he had accomplished at Santa Cruz. Other pilots agreed. It became a quiet bitterness inside the air group. It would remain so for decades. Vejtasa said nothing publicly. He accepted the Navy Cross. He continued flying. He continued training. In early 1943, his combat tour ended, and he was ordered stateside to Naval Air Station Atlantic City, New Jersey, to train new fighter pilots for the growing Pacific Fleet. He never flew in combat again. His final combat score stood at 10 1/4 aerial victories, 3 Zero fighters claimed at Coral Sea. 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed at Santa Cruz, a shared kill from earlier in the war. He was one of the highest-scoring Wildcat pilots of the entire United States Navy. The Japanese pilots who had fought him did not fare as well. Kakuichi Takahashi, the man who had led the strike on Yorktown at Coral Sea, was already at the bottom of the Coral Sea. He had died in his attack on May 8, 1942. His body was never recovered. Lieutenant Commander Shigekizu Shimazaki, who had led the Zuikaku torpedo planes at Coral Sea, survived that battle. He rose through the ranks. He was killed in January 1944-5 while commanding the 668th Naval Air Group. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, the strike force commander, who had sent his pilots against Yorktown and Lexington in May and 42, was killed in August 1944 when his submarine, I-166, was sunk by an American submarine off Saipan. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, who had ordered the retreat at Coral Sea when he realized his air groups were too depleted to continue, survived the war. He died in 1975 at the age of 85. Of the approximately 400 elite Japanese pilots who had begun the Pacific War in December 1941 as the finest carrier aviators in the world, fewer than 30 were still alive on the day Japan surrendered in August 1945. What the Imperial Japanese Navy could not replace was not their aircraft. It was their pilots. The Japanese pilots who fought Vejtasa at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz had accumulated their skills over the course of a decade. They had flown against Chinese fighters. They had flown against British fighters. They had flown against Dutch, Australian, and American pilots across the Pacific. Each Japanese pilot took years to train. The men who replaced them, as the war ground on, received months of training, then weeks. Then, by 1945, hours. He stayed in the Navy. The war ended in August 1945, but his career was only beginning. He commanded fighter squadrons. He served as air officer aboard USS Essex during the Korean War. He attended the Naval War College. He rose steadily through the ranks. In November 1962, Captain Stanley Vejtasa assumed command of USS Constellation. She was one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world. She carried more than 80 aircraft. She could project American power across any ocean on the planet. 20 years earlier, Vejtasa had been a junior lieutenant fighting to save Enterprise from Japanese pilots he had never met. Now, he commanded a ship larger than Enterprise had ever been. He commanded her for 1 year. He retired from the United States Navy on July 1, 1970, with the rank of captain. 32 years of service, 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Bronze Stars, the Legion of Merit, a dozen other decorations. He never received the Medal of Honor. The question resurfaced during his retirement. Journalists asked him about Santa Cruz, about the 7 kills, about the medal that never came. He deflected. He spoke about the men who had not come back. He spoke about James Flatley, who had believed in him and had recommended him for the highest honor the nation could bestow. Flatley had died in 1958, a vice admiral. He never knew that Kincaid had buried the Medal of Honor recommendation. In 2012, an author named Ted Edwards began researching Vejtasa's life for a biography. He interviewed the aging pilot extensively. He recorded hours of conversation about Coral Sea, about Santa Cruz, about the men and the machines and the decades that followed. Edwards traced the Medal of Honor paperwork through the naval archives. The evidence was clear. Flatley had submitted the recommendation. Kincaid had downgraded it. The decision had been made for reasons that had nothing to do with what Vejtasa had done on October 26, 1942. Edwards titled his book 7 at Santa Cruz. Stanley Winfield Vejtasa died on January 23, 2013. He was 98 years old. In accordance with his wishes, he was cremated. His ashes were scattered at sea, in the same Pacific Ocean where the men he had fought had died more than 70 years earlier. The Medal of Honor question remains open. Congress has the authority to waive time limitations for such awards. Presidents have occasionally approved retroactive medals for World War II veterans whose heroism was overlooked. It has not yet been done for Vejtasa. He never asked. He never lobbied. He never complained. He let the record speak for itself. The record speaks loudly. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was never designed to fight the Mitsubishi A6M0. It was slower. It was less maneuverable. It could not climb as fast. It could not dive as steeply. The Japanese pilots who flew Zeros in the spring of 1942 were the most experienced carrier aviators alive. Nothing in the American training pipeline had prepared any dive bomber pilot to fight them. Nothing in the doctrine suggested a Dauntless could survive an engagement with 3 of them at once, let alone destroy any of them. Vejtasa did not know that, or if he knew it, he chose not to believe it. He turned into the attacks. He fought with his forward guns and his rear guns and his wingtips. His radioman fought with him from the back seat. Together they came home to Yorktown when 4 of their squadron mates did not. 5 months later, Vejtasa did it again, in a Wildcat, against dive bombers and torpedo planes, against Japanese pilots as skilled as any who had ever taken off from a carrier deck. He broke a torpedo attack that should have finished USS Enterprise. He probably saved the ship. He may have saved the Guadalcanal campaign. His commanding officer wrote 7 words in his flight logbook. His task force commander buried the Medal of Honor recommendation. The Navy gave him a Navy Cross instead. It was his 3rd. He accepted it without protest and went back to work. The Japanese pilots who died fighting Stanley Vejtasa were the best the Empire had. The Japanese pilots who replaced them were not. That was the true legacy of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. Not the ships sunk, not the medals given or withheld, not even the men killed. It was the veterans the Empire could not afford to lose. Vejtasa outlived them all. He commanded a supercarrier. He trained the pilots who would fly the next war. He watched from a quiet retirement as the country he had served became something the men of 1942 could not have imagined. He died in his 99th year in a country at peace with a Pacific Ocean full of ghosts. He never spoke about them. He did not need to.